Okay, so I said Clouser minnow is a jig. You can cast it with the spinning rod. You can fish it with a spinning rod just as well as you can with a fly rod, maybe even better. So Clouser minnow is one of the greatest flies of all time. This is not a comically huge one, right? It's about 4 inches long. It's got large brass eyes. Those are not tungsten, they're not lead. There's no hidden lead wraps in here or anything, right? So I'm gonna guess this weighs somewhere between a 1/16 and an 1/8 of an ounce. It's tied with Icelandic sheep wool. I tie a variety of these. I tie with sheep's wool, I tie with EP fiber, and I tie with bucktail, and it's all just to get a different kind of action. The Icelandic sheep hair is real flowy, the EP is kind of flowy, and the bucktail is not flowy at all. And it just depends how I want that fly to look in the water, and I'll let the fish decide. But this is a very this is what I use when I'm fishing deep water or very strong currents, or both, right? So I want this to get down. That's the whole point of it. It needs to get down to the bottom or close to it, just like a jig. So that's why I call it is a jig. So I'm going to cast it with a spinning rod, and it's not a good one. Ugly Stick GX2, 6 foot, medium action, not even ultralight, and it's got 10 or 12 pound test strand on it. Not sure what it is. It's old. It's not good line. It's got a lot of line memory. So this is worst case scenario. This thing's kind of bulky and fluffy, right? So it's got some air resistance to it. It would get better once it got wet because it all collapsed down, right? But this is going to provide some air resistance. Crappy line, not a particularly high dollar rod, all right? But I'm going to go cast this because it's a jig. It's going to cast exactly like a jig. Will you look at that? So that casts exactly like a jig of equivalent weight on this rod. All right, so if I were to put on a marabou jig of equivalent weight to this, if I put on a marabou jig that weighs the same as this, at least on the first cast while it's still fluffy, it's going to cast about like that. So I'm not getting monster casts here, but it's casting just fine. It's good enough for fishing. Now, if I were to use a faster action rod, I could cast it farther. If it was more tippy, you know, I could get more speed. I could develop more, you know, I could get more behind it. If I used better, the real limiting factor here is the line. If I switched out to braid, 10 or 12 pound braid, or like firewire, the fused firewire, something like that, this would cast way farther because the line would be a lot thinner, right? But needless to say, it casts just fine. Now, my other contention is that this is going to fish maybe better with the spinning rod than a fly rod. Why? Diameter of the line. So the whole point of a Clouser minnow is we want it to sink, right? It is going to sink faster with thinner line, right? If we want it to sink slower, we're going to change the weight of the eyes, right? We might use bead chain or something like that, or smaller eyes. So I could put medium or even small brass eyes on there, and it would sink slower. But most of the time we want it to go down pretty fast. If we're fishing deep water, heavy current. If I had one of those lighter ones, I would use a correspondingly weighted spinning rod. So if I had one that was just like on, say, like a size 8 hook with just a regular bead chain eyes, I could cast that with a lighter and ultralight spinning rod, especially if it was a quality one and not an El Cheapo. So yeah, it's going to go down, it's going to sink faster with mono. Fly line is thick, it has a lot of drag in the water. Even sinking lines have a bigger diameter, and so they sink slower, and they also have a planing effect. The thicker your line is, the more it planes. So if you're casting out and you're jigging in the current and it's swinging across the current, I do a lot of that where I'm casting out, letting it do a mend, let it sink down, and then jig it off the bottom, but then I'm going to let it go ahead and swing on the end. And a lot of times at the end of that swing, right as it comes to the end of that swing, that's when you catch a fish, right? In fact, you should let it dangle there for a minute. You catch a lot of fish on the dangle. And I'm using, like a lot of times I'm using a skagit head and sink tips, right? But it's going to start coming back up. And it's going to, the faster the water is, the more likely it is to plane up fast. By using just mono, it's not going to do that quite as fast. So that makes it a little more efficient than fly fishing it. But do I fish this with this rod or any of my spinning rods? No, I don't. I fish it with fly rods because it's fun. That's the way I like to fish. I like fly fishing. I like fly casting. I like tying flies. So, and that's what it's all about, having fun.